Hi class, Dr. E here. We're going to be talking about the muscular system in this chapter. So let me get your slide view going. There we go. Okay, so first off, we'll talk about the details of what a skeletal muscle fiber looks like. So remember when we talked about cells and you realized that a cell has a cytoplasm, a nucleus, and all the different organelles. Well, that was a very typical looking kind of cell when it was a sphere or a globe. A muscle fiber looks very different. And that's the case in order to help with its function, which is contraction. So this right here is a one skeletal muscle fiber, and it has the same components, so they just have different names to them. So it does have a cell membrane. That cell membrane is known as a sarcolemma. It has a cytoplasm where all of the structures are pretty much floating in, and that cytoplasm is known as a sarcoplasm. It also has an endoplasmic reticulum, but it has a fancier name to it, which is the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And it has these myofibrils. These myofibrils, you've got thin ones, those are known as actin, and thicker ones, and those are known as myosin. It has obviously tons and tons of mitochondria. And as you can see here, skeletal muscle fibers have more than one nucleus, so it is multinucleated. And it has a very important structure known as the triad, or a triad which is made out of the cisterns of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which pretty much means a place to store calcium. Okay, so these are your two cisterns of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, the orange structures, and then right in the middle you can see that yellow T-tubule, and that is how the electricity is going to enter into the muscle fiber, where it comes from the nerve, and it is transferred from the nerve into the muscle fiber. So you see how that triad is a very important structure, where you have the T-tubule bringing in the electricity or bringing in the action potential, and the cisterns have the calcium that is stored, and we'll see how important calcium is for muscle contraction. If you take a look at, even a deeper look at the myofibrils, you can see again that you have these thinner actin fibers and these thicker myosin fibers. And where the thin actin fibers attach, they give you that zigzag line that is known as the Z line. Where the myosin fibers attach, those are known, you can see these little purple dots, that's known as an M line. And from one Z line to the next Z line is known as the sarcomere, which is the functional unit of your skeletal muscle. If you take a look at all the different parts, you can see different colors and they have different names to them. So we could see it over here as well. So again, from one Z line to your next Z line, that is your sarcomere. So this whole unit is known as the sarcomere. Across the Z line, you could see that lighter blue band that is known as the I band, and that's made only and exclusively of the thin actin fibers. So the I letter is a very thin letter, and those are made of your thin fibers only. While this portion right here you can see is an overlap of the thin and thick fibers, and that is known as your known as the A band. And the A band has a part on top which is very thin, and the part on the bottom, or the letter A, part on top which is thin, and the part on the bottom which is thick. And that is, that'll help us remember that the A band is made out of a mixture of both the thin and thick fibers. While across the M line, you can see that a little H zone, and the H zone is made out of thick fibers only, so only myosin fibers. And again, H is kind of like a thicker letter on both ends, and so that would be made out of your thick fibers only. These are just little mnemonics that help me remember which parts make different bands. With an electron microscope, you can see these thick myosin fibers, and you can see that they have these little hearts at the very tip. These hearts are known as myosin heads, and these are very important for muscle contraction. The rest of the fibers are all thin fibers. So you have these that kind of look like these beads. Those are your actin. And then you have what look like ropes. Those are tropomyosin. And then you have these bluish structures that look like little tiny rockets, and those are troponin. So the aim for muscle contraction, in order for a muscle to contract, there is a binding site that is hiding underneath the troponin and the tropomyosin. So you'd have to move the troponin and tropomyosin from their positions, and in order to reveal that active site or the binding site, and then this myosin head right here will attach to the binding site and do the contraction. So for contraction of a muscle fiber, there's an interaction between chemistry and physics. So you need a neurotransmitter, which is the order coming from the nerve to the muscle in order to contract. And then there has to be that interaction between the myosin and the actin in order for for the contraction to occur. So you can see here, this is the junction between the motor neuron and the skeletal muscle fiber on the other end. That is known as a neuromuscular junction. You can also call it a myoneural junction, so either way is correct. And that is a synapse, or a meeting between a nerve and the skeletal muscle. So we'll try to break down the parts of the neuromuscular junction, and this is a bigger picture of it in order to to see it. So you have here the neuron terminal, or the end of the motor neuron, and inside of it you can see these little tiny vesicles. Those are synaptic vesicles that contain neurotransmitters, which are chemicals, and the neurotransmitter in the neuromuscular junction is acetylcholine. You can also see obviously tons of mitochondria as well. And then there's a little gap between the nerve and the skeletal muscle that is known as the synaptic cleft. And on this end, this is now where the skeletal muscle is. Okay, so that would be your motor end plate. Okay, so these right here make the parts of your neuromuscular junction. And again, the electricity will be coming down the nerve, okay, and somehow it has to overcome that gap, that synaptic cleft, and reach the motor end plate on the skeletal muscle. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So for the stimulus of the contraction, you'll get the electricity or the action potential, with the order to contract on that motor neuron, and then it reaches that synaptic terminal right here. And so I'll take a look at the bigger picture so you can better understand this. And what happens when the action potential reaches the synaptic terminal is that calcium comes into the area, and that calcium literally pushes the synaptic vesicles towards the end here, and you can see here now that the acetylcholine is being released across the synaptic cleft. The acetylcholine pretty much swims across the synaptic cleft and attaches to the receptors on this end, on the skeletal muscle. Once that happens, that means that skeletal muscle is now going to start preparing for contraction. In order to do that, changes are going to happen where sodium and potassium, there's changes in their permeability, and that will lead to an action potential on this end of the muscle. So now we have what the body was able to do is to take that action potential from the nerve and transmit it over to the muscle end. Now that the action potential is in the muscle, remember the sarcoplasmic reticulum that we talked about. So I'm just going to go back a couple of slides to take a look at it. So the calcium will be released from that sarcoplasmic reticulum. Calcium will attach to troponin, and troponin and tropomyosin are going to move out of the way, and that will lead to the very first steps of muscle contraction. So instead of reading this, I'd prefer to use this picture right here of the excitation-contraction coupling. meaning that we have excited the muscle fiber and it is now going to contract. And so that mechanism is known as the excitation contraction coupling. So we talked about the excitation part, which is how the action potential reaches or crosses over from the nerve end to the muscle end at the neuromuscular junction. Now for the contraction part. So I'm really going to start kind of like at this point right here where that myosin head has an ATP molecule. It hydrolyzes the ATP molecule, which means it breaks it down into ADP and phosphate, meaning that now the myosin head has lots of energy and is trying to look for an active site in order to contract, or a binding site to contract. So you see it right here, again, with the ADP and phosphate, but all of the binding sites are covered at this point. In order to contract, the calcium, you see here calcium comes in, it'll bind to troponin, and that binding changes the shape of troponin, moving it out of the way. Tropomyosin is also going to move, and now you can see these little purple binding sites. That's where the myosin heads will attach. So these myosin heads you see here are now attached to those binding sites, and it will lead to a stroke, meaning to a contraction, a very small contraction of these muscle fibers. Now these leading to sliding of the actin on top of myosin. So you can see here how it's stroking. And in order for that, excuse me, now that myosin head has to release itself from the binding site in order to perform another stroke. And it won't do that until it gets more ATP. So it gets an ATP, it hydrolyzes it again into ADP and phosphate, it lets go of the binding site, and it is known as cocking back into its position, okay, in order to get ready for another stroke and so on. So you see it's really a cycle that keeps on going in order for a muscle contraction to happen. When muscle contracts, all the actin and myosin slide on top of each other, and that is known as the sliding filament model. That leads to shortening of the muscle, shortening of all of the sarcomeres, shortening of all the zones. So the H zone and the I bands, they all tend to narrow. The Z lines come closer to each other, so the sarcomere shrinks a little bit, and that is what contraction is really all about. The cross-bridge cycling, we already talked about that. So if you feel that you need to listen to it again, feel free to rewind the video and do that. When the muscle contracts, after the muscle contracts, it needs to relax, and that is also an active process, meaning that it also needs ATP. So in order for the muscle to contract, we have to get rid of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. There is an enzyme that does that. It's known as acetylcholine esterase enzyme. It's going to decompose acetylcholine. It also sometimes, also the muscle has the ability to pump or to kind of more properly to kind of vacuum back in all of the calcium that it released. So there's a calcium pump that'll put all the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And when those two happen, a combination between breaking down the acetylcholine and getting rid of the calcium, that will lead to dissociation between the myosin head and the actin, because really all of the troponin and tropomyosin, all of that went back into its position, and it's now covering and hiding the binding sites on actin. So that's how your muscle fiber relaxes. So remember that contraction is an active process, okay? It needs ATP. So does relaxation. So in order for the calcium pump to act and, vacuum in all of the calcium, that is actually an active process that needs ATP. So where does all this energy come from? Well, we do break down glucose through cellular respiration. There is a little bit of reserve of ATP, so there's a little amount that's already there in the muscle. And, when we have lots of ATP, we kind of break that down into ADP and phosphate. That phosphate doesn't go anywhere. The muscle keeps it attached to creatine, so that when I really need to remake my ATP again, I'll just take that phosphate and bind it to an ADP and recreate my ATP storage again. We really already talked about cellular respiration, but just very short. There are two different phases. There's an anaerobic and an aerobic phase. The anaerobic is the glycolysis that happens in the cytoplasm. It doesn't make lots of ATP, while the aerobic phase is the citric acid cycle and electron transport chain. Both of these, as you guys already know, happen in the mitochondria. They are the producers of most of your ATP. Luckily enough, muscles have what is known as myoglobin, which is kind of a cousin of hemoglobin. And myoglobin is able to store extra oxygen in the muscles, and that's why most of our muscle fibers are able to go through this aerobic phase of respiration. Now, oxygen debt. So if the muscle doesn't have enough oxygen and is unable to enter the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain, what happens is that we produce lactic acid. So remember, lactic acid is the reason our muscles are sore after a very strenuous exercise. And that lactic acid will be transported through the bloodstream to the liver, and in the liver, it'll be converted back into glucose. In order for that to happen, the liver needs oxygen. It also needs energy, and that is known as the oxygen debt. So the amount of oxygen the liver needs to change back that lactic acid back into glucose is known as your oxygen debt. Okay. So you can see here that glycogen is stored in the liver. Glycogen is, you can break it down into glucose, and it's a reversible. It is really a reversible thing where glucose, we can also put them together and make bigger molecules of glycogen. But in case of contractions, we need now glucose, so we're going to break it down, that glycogen storage, break it down to glucose. We're going to use it to make some ATP, but again, in the absence of oxygen, it breaks down into lactic acid. Now that lactic acid will be carried away, or flushed away by the circulation, by the bloodstream, and go to the liver. That lactic acid is going to be converted back into glucose. As you see, it needs energy to do that. It also needs lots of oxygen. And that, again, is your oxygen debt. Sometimes we all reach a point of muscle fatigue, and that is where the muscles are unable to contract. That could be due to low blood flow. So as we age and we get atherosclerotic blood vessels, that we're not getting enough blood and enough oxygen to the muscles, so the muscles can fatigue easier. It could also be due to an imbalance in ions, especially as you can see sodium and potassium and calcium ions. It could be also accumulation of lactic acid or just the loss of desire to continue to exercise. So depression and fatigue, all of these are reasons to get muscle fatigued. A muscle cramp, though, on the other hand, is a sustained involuntary contraction of the muscle. So it's not that you are trying to contract the muscle, it's something that happens beyond your control. And it could also be due to an imbalance in these ions. Heat production in the body. So remember that one of the functions of the muscle, of skeletal muscle, is not just to contract and move the body, but it is also heat production. So about half of your cellular respiration is being used by the muscles, and we're producing heat. So the muscles are the major source of body heat. Actually, it's the cardiac muscle that is the major source of body heat. So to be specific, okay, and that heart is going to, through the blood, it will transport that heat to the rest of the body. A muscular response, so if you ever had an EMG, which is an electromyogram, which is technically putting a little electricity to muscles, the muscle contracts, so there's a little twitch of the muscle, and then you're recording that twitch using a graph, and that is what is known as an EMG. So I'm just going to show you the picture of an EMG. in order for the muscle to contract, you really have to put it has to reach a threshold. So just like the threshold of an action potential in the nerve, if you don't reach that threshold, the muscle isn't going to twitch. So as you can see here, this is the point where you put in the electricity, or you put in the impulse. And then there's a little period here where the muscle is kind of preparing to contract, and that is known as your latent period. And this right here is your muscle contracting and then the muscle relaxing. And now it is back to its resting position. You can see here that contraction happens a little bit faster than the relaxation does. There's a relationship between the length of the muscle and the strength of the muscle. So in order to get your best results when contracting the muscle, you want your muscle to be in the optimal position. So think of heavyweight lifters and how they position themselves before they actually carry their weights. So they are trained to put their muscles in the best position where they can get the most out of their muscles. Okay, so or think also about if you're trying to stretch really high, you've got something all the way up in the cupboards that you can barely reach, so you're stretching your muscles, and that thing happens to be a little bit on the heavy side, and now you're unable to carry it because your muscles are so stretched out that they can't carry the weight that they would have if that thing was maybe on the table. So again, all depending on how you position your muscles, you can either they would either be able to carry something or not. Okay, so again, you want to position them in the optimal length. If the muscles are too short, they're weaker. If they're overstretched, they're also weaker. Summation is a process where we don't really count on a single tiny muscle twitch. For power, what happens is there are tons of muscle twitches and they're all added up together in order to give you that muscle power. So you see here that these are like kind of individual muscle twitches, but what happens is that the muscle twitches tend to add up together. So you see that they add up and they're higher and higher until you reach the maximal amount of muscle contraction that you need, and then your muscle goes back to relaxing. Unfortunately, this thing is covering the third slide, but you can open it up in your slides. And what is happening here is that instead of going back to relaxing, the muscle really stays contracted, and that is a pathology. It's known as a tetanic contraction, and that happens when in patients with tetanus. Recruitment of motor units. So a motor unit is each nerve fiber, each motor neuron with its muscle fibers that it controls. So each motor neuron controls or relays that electricity, the action potential, to a certain number of muscle fibers. So you can see, for example, this motor neuron 1 ends on these purple fibers, while this motor neuron 2 ends on the red muscle fibers. So that would be a motor unit, and this is a second motor unit. What your body is a very conservative creature. What it does is it tries to use as the least amount of motor units as possible. But if it can't do the function, it will start recruiting more motor units. So for example, if you're trying to carry something light, and it finds that it could do that with just motor unit 1, it will. If motor unit 1 isn't enough, it'll start recruiting motor unit 2. If it needs more, it'll recruit motor unit 3, and so on. We don't really feel that. It kind of happens very smooth. It's a very smooth process. And the bigger the muscle, the bigger the motor unit. So for example, your back muscle fibers, with your back muscles, which really have to be contracting pretty much all day, whether you're laying down, you're sitting, you're standing, and you don't really need fine movements of the muscles of the back. So the motor units are huge. If you compare that to the motor units of your fingers where you need fine motor skills in order to type or to write, to paint and so on. So you need those fine these fine muscle coordination movements. You'll have smaller motor units. So we already talked about the recruitment of motor units. In order for a contraction to be sustained, like we said, the body will recruit the smaller units first, and then it will go on to recruit bigger units and so on in order to sum them all up and lead to a smooth muscle contraction. Muscle toning, so we always say that the muscle contracts and then relaxes. Really, that is not fully correct. I mean, muscles really don't relax fully. They are in a state of what is known as muscle tone, so they are partially contracted, and that's what gives our bodies that muscle tone. So if you've ever tried to carry a kid, when they're awake, and then you try to carry them when they're asleep, they are much heavier when they're sleeping because they have lost that muscle tone. So again, your muscle tone is that continuous state of partial contraction of these resting muscles. So rested muscles really are not in full relaxation. They are in what is known as partial contraction. Different kinds of contraction that we have, we've got isotonic and isometric. Iso means the same. So isotonic means that the tone of the muscle is the same. You're contracting the muscle, but you're not changing the tone. What is changing is the length of the muscle. So you're either shortening it, like this concentric movement, where you're bringing the weight towards the body, and you're shortening the biceps muscle, or in this case, it's known as the eccentric contraction, where you're lengthening the muscle. So you're moving the weight away from your muscle. So in here, you're actually elongating the biceps muscle. An isometric contraction means that you are not changing the length of the muscle in this contraction. So think of, that you're holding, say, a towel bar that is attached to the wall, and you're trying to pull it away. So and it's attached there. So there really is no movement. What you're doing is changing the tone of the muscle, but the length of the muscle isn't changed. Now we have different muscle fibers because we have different needs of muscles. So again, comparing the back muscles to the function, say, of your fine muscles of the hand. So not all muscle fibers are the same. We've got what are known as slow twitch muscle fibers. Those are your type 1. Again, think back to your back muscles. These are the muscles that are pretty much contracting almost 24 hours a day. So they have to have a very, very good blood supply. They're browner and reddish brown in color because of all that blood supply. They have large amounts of myoglobin and mitochondria. They are always oxidative in the respiration. Okay, they're very resistant to fatigue. Compare that to these type 2 muscle fibers. They're both fast twitched. One of them is fatigue resistant and one of them is glycolytic. So I'm actually going to talk about the type 2B first. And those are the muscle fibers that lead to those fast twitches. So if you're, kind of going back to reflexes, those muscle fibers that if you're in a case of emergency and that leads you to leap away from that emergency, that would be your fast twitch glycolytic fiber that did that. They are white fibers, so because they have less myoglobin tends to give, that red color to muscle fibers. It has fewer mitochondria, so they do have the ability to contract very fast, but they run out of energy pretty fast. They're very susceptible to fatigue. The fast twitch fatigue resistance are kind of like somewhere in between both of these types. So everything you see is intermediate. So it has, when it comes to how fast they are kind of like in between. And when it comes to the myoglobin levels, it's somewhere in between the middle. The fibers are somewhere in the middle between these red fibers and these very white ones. Okay, they are mildly resistant to fatigue, so on. So again, this is kind of like somewhere in between these slow twitch fibers that are very resistant to fatigue and the fast twitch glycolytic, which are very white in color and more susceptible to fatigue. And that concludes this chapter.